Good afternoon. My name is Erfan Ibrahim, and I'm your host for the SmartGrid educational series. And this is a monthly webinar series that occurs on the second Monday of every month. We had to move it to the third Monday in June in order to accommodate some schedule conflict of our speaker today. But normally we have this webinar on the second Monday of every month at 1 p.m. And there is a little description about this webinar series and its purpose. The primary reason why I put this together starting in January was that I felt that there was a significant knowledge gap in key areas of smart grid and green tech, energy efficiency, that needed to be filled in order for the diverse skill set that exists in our industry to be able to leverage their skills in the development and implementation of the smart grid. And as a result of these presentations, there have been several good business contacts made, networking opportunities, as well as it gives people who don't have a background in this area an opportunity to evaluate their potential role in this area. So I am very pleased that after 6 months, we've had significant communication, information exchange, as well as an education process occurring. This month, we are dedicating it to distributed energy resources. As you know that we have a webinar that occurs on the second Monday of every month, and then we have a seminar that occurs on the fourth Monday of the month. And the seminar is actually a face-to-face interaction opportunity here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I also run a concurrent webinar with it. IBM has been very kind to provide us their facility in Foster City to host these seminars. Our next seminar is going to be on June 25th, which is a Monday, from 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. Pacific. And we are going to continue the theme of distributed energy resources in that seminar when Francis Cleveland of Xanthus Consulting is going to speak about the standards work that is going on in distributed energy resources at NIST and at other organizations. And also, she will explain how the development of these standards will help bring in distributed energy resources onto the grid in a safe and reliable and scalable manner. So please look out for my communication on that seminar on June 25th, and you'll have an opportunity to RSVP for that, whether you want to come in person to Foster City and attend the seminar or attend via the webinar. The other event that is occurring this month is this 9th Annual Global California Conference on June 22nd in San Jose, California. And this slide shows you some of the details of this event. I was asked by Shannon Fraser of the Department of Commerce to share this information, and I will be sending this PDF document out to all of you after this call in the next day or so you'll have all the details. But this information is available. This event is occurring here in the Bay Area. Now I'd like to move to our talk today, which is on distributed energy resources. And Dave Cohen and I have been talking for the better part of the last month on how to introduce this topic. And we are starting today with an introductory presentation that explains the value proposition and also, as the title shows, some examples of how DER will impact the smart grid. My hope is that this is going to be a series of talks in which we will ask Dave to tell us about the different aspects of distributed energy resources. So before I pass the presenter ball to Dave, I want to just spend a moment to talk about some of his contributions in the industry. Dave Cohen is now the person running Evolution 7, and he has over 26 years of emerging energy technology company experience, specializing in renewable energy, telecommunications, and software. And he has co-founded 3 startup companies and has initiated and completed numerous R&D joint ventures and partnerships in the U.S., Europe, Latin America, and Australia. He's nationally renowned for his pioneering work in distributed energy communications and smart grid control applications. And while he was at Infertility, which he co-founded and was CEO, he was responsible for 2 firsts for the smart grid industry: intelligent agent-based software infrastructure for electric grid control applications, and this was seed funded by the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Electricity Program, and a real-time published subscribed software platform for automating demand response and real-time information tracking of meter data. And another contribution that Dave has made is that he was one of the founding members of the GridWise Architecture Council, where he helped to write the smart grid language used in the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. And he's quite active in the NIST smart grid standards development work. And Dave received his MS in engineering and his BA in environmental studies from the University of Colorado, with a focus on computer science, energy analysis, GIS, and artificial intelligence. So we have a true leader in our midst here, and we're really looking forward to hearing from him. So Dave, I'm going to now move the presenter ball over to you, and feel free to start your presentation.
Thank you, Erfan, and thank you everybody who are participating in this webinar. I know I've signed up for a few of these, and it's hard to coordinate and get yourself situated to listen on the phone and watch all these presentations, but I'm very excited about distributed energy resources. I do have a bent towards the renewable side of it, but I've been working in all aspects of the communications and control, trying to represent distributed energy resources on the grid. And I looked quickly at the attendee list, and there's a few people that I recognize actually that I've worked with, and anybody that I haven't, I look forward to the opportunity to work with all of you, because it's such a overarching problem and really for me a passion of how you get distributed energy resources. I have to say, I hope I don't have to define distributed energy resources, but I guess what I would say is that over the years I've seen a fairly, just like microgrids, the term microgrids, I've seen people misrepresent what that really means. But from my perspective, what I mean by distributed energy resources is any small scale, probably under 100 kilowatt, but these days with microgrids, those are going way up in size, energy source that can be in combination with other energy sources. So examples of photovoltaic systems and now emerging electric vehicles, and even things like demand response and intelligent control strategies to do load reduction in buildings are under the category of distributed energy resource. In the past, there's been, of course, microturbines and fuel cells talked about, and multiple battery technologies, and all those are game, as we'll talk about. But what we really, from my perspective, my interest comes from, my background is in the building energy controls world, and then I moved from kind of looking at the building and then moving into sort of standalone distributed energy systems, and then how those now integrate from, surprisingly, most of where the distributed energy resources are going to connect to the grid are, again, via buildings. So there's a lot of this sort of building to grid talk now, which I think is a relevant point about distributed energy resources. A lot of these, I believe, will be co-located near facilities. So let me walk through. I've got about 20 slides, and Erfan, I think I have, what, 40 minutes or so?
Oh, feel free. You can take more if you like.
Great. So when Erfan asked me to talk about the benefits, let me move this slide forward first. I guess this slide really is just for your background and benefit. I'm not going to go into the details, but I've been working on various evolutionary aspects of this, how to integrate distributed energy resources into the grid for quite a while, going back somewhere into the time frame of about 1984. And in that process, I've been looking at managing different types of distributed energy resources and looking at modeling various types of distributed energy resources, how to model them and how to control them and how to aggregate them into the grid. So there's a lot of, right now there seems to be a lot of reproduction of a lot of things that I've seen many times over in my career. The concept of virtual power plants is not a new one. It's been around at least back to 1996 when a company that was in northern Colorado in Windsor called N-Corp was trying to push that forth. And then when I was at Silicon Energy, we built a platform on behalf of several utilities and ABB and some others where we were looking at how to model and control in aggregate distributed energy resources on the grid, and this concept of virtual power plants is all about that. So there's a lot of, I think a lot of people are now starting to realize that this is a very mainstream concept now, and it's going to become more significant. Sorry, I keep pressing the button on my computer and it's not advancing. I have to use the actual interface. The industry alignment, I think from my standpoint, the Department of Energy and EPRI and some of these other initiatives deserve a lot of credentials here, because a lot of the actual precursor and pathway to paving what these things are and what the value is, and companies like RMI, who wrote, Small is Profitable, and other types of studies that have been done over the years, this has all been built on the backs of a lot of people who have been passionate about this for a very long time. So even though I'm very involved and passionate, I thank a lot of other initiatives for helping to really make this a relevant story and something that can be understood by everybody. But all the traditional GridWise and IntelliGrid and the Galvin initiative and some of the issues, the OpenADR for demand response, and there's just too many to name, but I think the alignment here is that without these initiatives, we really wouldn't be where we're at. So this is taken from a company I formed a couple years ago called Evolution 7, and the idea of Evolution 7 was just to represent within various types of microgrid sizes distributed energy resources. And essentially the problem statement, I took it right from there because it was so relevant. But essentially the energy supply from the production, the delivery, and the whole infrastructure has been based on fossil fuels. It's centralized, and the way that we produce energy and deliver energy from the beginning to the end down the stream, as well as the way the grid's been developed. As everyone knows, the SmartGrid is really nothing more than trying to enable a two-way grid in a situation where the grid was designed, as everybody knows, to do centralized one-way pushing of energy. And what we're talking about with distributed energy resources is now these resources can talk back to the system and produce power and feed it back into the system locally, which is the real benefit. If you look at what's going to happen here, there's some examples. I had a slide where I think in Denmark where you looked at they have a map that shows the size, the relative size, and the relative dispersion and distribution of renewables. And in places like Denmark, you can actually look on the map and see that there's a lot more smaller distributed stuff going in. There's a city in in Japan, where I think it's 100% photovoltaic renewables on the roofs of most of the buildings. In the maybe 7 to 10 years ago, when we talked about this to utilities and talked to distribution engineers and then the standards bodies thinking about the interconnection standards like the IEEE 1547 standards, it was always looked at as these distributed energy resources would either be something way far out in the future or they're noise on the system. And most of the engineers agreed that if you had less than 10% on your distribution feeder, it would be manageable. There are some places where this is occurring, where this is starting to become a real problem now, and I've worked on several studies looking at what happens when you have too much integration of renewables and you get this variable generation, and it starts messing with the integrity of the distribution feeders in the system. So if you get too much backfeed at any one time, it can cause circuits to open up, and it can cause reliability issues, even though what you're trying to do is make the system more reliable. In fact, in the 1547 interconnection standard for distributed energy, the thing that you'd like to do the most is not allowed, which is allow distributed energy resources to run when the system goes down, and that's all based on very valid principles such as safety, so that you don't electrocute anybody. But essentially, one of the things that we see is the emergence of how you're going to integrate. One of the biggest issues that I see with distributed energy, beyond the financing and the permitting and actually making an economic case, is what happens, how do you then pave the path for large backfeed and integration of these things. A prime example that people are, I'm not sure anyone's congealed on any real sort of consensus yet, but there's been so many different points about what's going to happen with electric vehicles. It's going to take the system down because there's too many vehicles. They're going to change the pattern. I've heard stories where it's not going to do anything and everyone's going to charge at night. And I've heard stories where in different parts of load circuits and things like that, it's really going to be an issue because we're going to be creating all this load on the system, and we have to be able to deal with that. So then you talk about how do you mitigate all these things moving into the grid? Well, there's things like doing load balancing with demand response in buildings that I've done quite a bit of work on. The issue that I see is that I did a lot of work in the energy simulation side of using DOE2 to simulate many different types of distributed energy resources and building intelligent buildings and control strategies. And the thing that always showed up was the fact that no matter how much you, from a scientific perspective, approach this problem, from the issue of engineering analysis and schedules, that individual human behavior is something that's hard to predict. So the notion that we know that electric vehicles are not going to be a problem because everybody's going to charge between 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. and 6 in the morning is just simply, I don't believe it. I think that people want to drive when they want to drive, and they'll take either two paths. They'll either decide to keep driving a hybrid car that has a diesel or a gas engine, or they will actually want to charge whenever they can. So this is going to be an emerging problem, and it's an integration problem. What I'm going to try to do is walk through instead of trying to talk through a bunch of bullet points about what the issues and regulatory issues, I think a lot of people probably at the table are aware of most of the big issues. What I'd like to share with you is a couple of the things that I've worked on over the years and point out some of the things that have come up in the process of that. And in terms of the technologies, what we're talking about specifically in terms of the micro power technologies that can actually produce power are photovoltaic solar systems, fuel cells, plug hybrid electric vehicles, combined heat and power systems, wind to some extent. And you could add to that now with some of the ability to do demand response that you could call a demand response call, something like a proxy for a generator. And we've talked about that with megawatts and virtual power plants and so on, where by reducing the load and aggregating it and timing it and sequencing it correctly, we can make it look just like it's a generator output on the system if it's done correctly, and I can talk a little bit about that as well. There's also a lot of power conversion technologies. So there's inverter technology that are becoming smaller and more embedded in the PV world. Enphase just went public, and they've got a photovoltaic inverter technology that used to be the size of a pretty large computer box, if at the smallest, and they're embedding these into each panel. So now you're talking about an inverter that has the smarts and communication capability to actually talk to each panel independently. And think about the impacts of that in terms of the pervasiveness of these distributed energy resources. Now you're talking about a single panel that could be considered to be a distributed energy resource, and it can be monitored and controlled, and it could add different types of qualitative control strategies to the grid by itself and in aggregate. And then you've also got, of course, the power storage technologies, batteries, flywheels, EVs can be thought of as a storage technology. And of course, all the monitoring and control that goes with that, that gets into things like software agents and embedded intelligence and so on. So from my perspective, and maybe to the agreement of others, the real market drivers, so where this stuff shows up the most, is I tried to characterize it in terms of like, where you'd really see a lot of this happening first. And it's starting to happen in areas where you have carbon footprint zones and low carbon zones and green enterprise districts. And there's an example of a lot of that's happening right in my hometown in Boulder. We're currently undergoing and approved of the ability to become a municipal utility. And that's going to be a long-term process, but that's an example of where communities have decided that they want to kind of do their own thing based on how they want to generate a renewable power portfolio for themselves versus waiting for it to be offered to them. Areas where there's high load density, here's another area like we've worked on a project with Con Edison in Manhattan, and it's a very high density network, and so there's a lot of issues there. And so there you'll see a lot more focus on control strategies and how to control and embed intelligence into the network so that it can operate more efficiently and more autonomously. And then, of course, high utilization goes with high load density. High demand growth goes with that as well. And I consider this last one to be something that just sort of, is the area, is it operated by a market operator or system operator that actually encourages the ability to do what I call ancillary service-friendly transactions. And those are ancillary services are just another set of secondary things that the grid needs to operate in real time so that it can maintain integrity and reliability. And so distributed energy resources, as I'll point out in some of these examples, can contribute directly to that. This slide shows there's been several initiatives done by the European Union and more globally about this idea of, if we're trying to do carbon reduction, and this is really one of our goals, by looking at what has to happen by 2050, if you look at the graph, it just shows the different types of infrastructure that can contribute mostly to the carbon problem. And it starts with agriculture, water, buildings, industrial, transport, and then you've got road transport and power. And interestingly enough, I thought this was extremely telling because I've worked in two areas in this space. One is in the building energy load reduction, as well as what I consider to be renewable energy systems. And what it says, as well as in the electric vehicle side of things, where the electrification of vehicles as a way to reduce carbon footprint. And basically what it says is that by 2050, if we're to reach our goal, and that's an if, we would have to reduce by 80%. The decarbonization would have to come from power, road transport, and buildings. And that's significantly where, from my perspective, that's the most impact can come from distributed energy resources in all three of those sectors. So starting back, this isn't comprehensive, but we worked with a company, a research and development organization called CSIRO, Commonwealth Scientific Industrial Resource Organization. It has a great operation in Newcastle, and they combine their sort of ICT, communications and control, artificial intelligence, and distributed energy groups and put together a test site. And in the early days, we were trying to put together a software framework called Grid Agents at Infotility, and we were trying to look at how you would manage a microgrid. And so our first test was there in Australia. And it looks like the slide didn't show up, but essentially we had wind turbines, and we had a capstone microturbine and some intelligent building load controls, and monitored all this. And we were trying to ramp down the loads in the buildings to accommodate the variability of the generation in some of the intermittent renewables, and we did some tests on that with CSIRO. And then another example of this was in about 2008 time frame. We worked on a project with Con Edison, and if anyone's familiar with microgrids, this was sort of a precursor. We called it a compact network. So you go into Manhattan in Con Edison's territory, and you look at a couple of buildings, and the way the circuits are designed here is you can carve up these buildings into what's called a compact network. And at the time, Con Edison was branding this as their 3G, somewhat like telecom networks, where it's the next generation system of the future, SOS. And with that in design was embedded intelligence, be able to control the system by carving it up into small blocks and small chunks like city blocks, and then to apply different types of control strategies, which we called at the time advanced distribution operations strategies. And I'll walk through some of the things we discovered there, but we installed the software in some test environments, and we tested some use cases around these compact network control. And all of these, by the way, included inherently some sort of distributed energy resource, whether or not it was just simply a building, but it also talked about the concept that now you're looking at the actual electric distribution map of Con Edison, and you're zeroing in on a particular piece of the network. And so we developed this concept of, in this case, a compact network was as simple as, if you look at the diagrams around the outside of what you see right there, you see transformers. And then inside of that, you see what we had done is we represented agents to talk about things that could model, could read the meter. Anything with a G on it was a generator. Anything with an LC on it was a load control device. Anything with an A was an actuator. And so we thought, and then there's network protectors that are connected to the transformers. And the idea there was that if the transformers, there's a whole bunch of things we could do here, of course, but one example I'll walk through. So here's the legend. You've got all these things that are in buildings and close to the buildings, in proximity to the buildings on the grid. And these are all things that sort of operate as a sort of a mini microgrid, if you will. So if you did have generation sources such as a backup generator, photovoltaics on the roof, an electric vehicle plugged into the system, into the power panel, and then things like load controllers, examples of that are a daylight dimming system, or the ability to reset the heating cooling system up or down to reduce load, and then things that could be actuated on the grid themselves as well. So we actually mapped a whole distribution automation system into agents and modeled the agents with rules and started coming up with some control strategies that we could sort of prototype. And one example was the same compact network now where you actually have a backup generator. You've got transformers who have an agent modeling them, and the agents can be looking at very simple things like what's the temperature profile, what's it been in the past hour, where is it going, is it overheating? And essentially, one of the examples is that the transformers are overheating. It's a very hot day at 4 in the afternoon in the middle of summer in Manhattan, and the old school way was to go send a fire truck out and spray the transformer. What we're talking about is surgically going into the network and saying the transformer right around the corner of this compact network is actually overheating. It's going to either blow up or it's going to reduce its asset life. We can then go in and we can monitor those transformers with agents, and we can communicate that to the agents in the building with representing multiple buildings or single buildings. And then that agent can then talk to the individual loads in the building and say, we need to ramp down the load here right on this circuit so we can reduce the load on the transformers. So that's a perfect example of how you're using distributed energy resources to modify and impact the grid locally. And that's a more advanced version than just backfeeding power directly in. We came up with 12 to 14 of these different use cases, what we called them, of what you could do if you had the intelligence embedded into the actual monitoring and control system of the distribution system. And what was unique about it was that there's nothing really new about with SCADA systems and utilities where you can monitor transformer temperatures and so on in the building, in the utility control center. But there's nothing that coordinates that data with what's happening in the buildings. And so what we were trying to show is that agents could coordinate this and say distributed energy resources and the network itself can talk to each other and resolve problems and do it in a way that makes the grid more reliable. Mainly making the grid more reliable, possibly also doing things like reducing the electric demand in the building, which we worked on several things that went further than this in the future on the demand response side. Okay, I think I went too far. Excuse me. Marin Energy Authority. This diagram is fairly sparse and probably hard to understand, but if you look at it, the idea behind that was to model and monitor multiple distributed energy resources. Mainly what we did is we hooked up power quality metering to the inverters and the power panels where the photovoltaic systems were hooked up in the Marin Civic Center and a bunch of attached buildings, about 6 different buildings, with the idea that if you could intelligently monitor the output of the PV systems, that at the time when the smart grid becomes more advanced and you have things like electric vehicle infrastructure plugged in, you can then integrate that with, now if you've got EVs charging on the system and you understand your production output of the PV and the variability of that, if you're hooked into the building control panel and you need to then reduce load in order to optimize the either charging of the system or to accommodate the fact that there's variability on the side of the solar, you get sort of a mini version of a microgrid, because the true nature of a microgrid is the system gets completely isolated from the network, and you very quickly have to balance supply and demand and then do a very quick control strategy to make sure that you maintain power in the microgrid. In this case, this is more about optimized delivery, where you can choose, I want to have the lowest carbon footprint, I might want to have the lowest cost, or I also might want to have the highest amount of solar or renewable power going into the system. So we also did a pilot there, and that also got, we did some use cases on that, and this is about the time when the grid variability thing was really starting to heat up. And we started looking at being able to add analysis on the PV inverters. However, today, 2012, PV inverter technology is much more advanced than back in 2008-2009 timeframe. And theoretically, what you can do with PV inverters is you can control them in a way that allows you to vary how much power goes back onto the grid. So you can do what's called intelligent backfeed. And in the case where there's a lot of renewables going into the system at once, the idea of actually backing down on possibly some of the PV output so it doesn't all backfeed into the grid, and maybe pushing some of it into smart vehicle charging, maybe possibly pushing some of it somewhere else, would be a good thing in the case where you have too much at any given time. And there's a whole series of issues around that sort of what's called grid variability and there's a lot more, I think, interest and research on it now that people are seeing examples where there's more than they anticipated that are coming into the system. And to any case where utility business models start getting more sophisticated, where the utility becomes the owner of the asset and the manager of the asset, this will become much more of an issue for the utility itself. Right now, the grid variability problem and the whole issue about this is not really a problem for the consumer at all. It's a problem for the operator of the distribution network. But in the end, it's in everybody's best interest to make sure this is done in the best way. We also did, this process was also correlated, I'd say very lightly correlated, because it was an international R&D project with a parallel project in Holland called the Integral Project at the time. And in their case, they were looking at a very similar thing where they're concerned about what they call active networks, where there's large-scale penetration of renewable resources and distributed generation. And they're looking at the same basic issues. They have a little bit different terminology, and what they had an agent-based approach called Power Matcher that was developed in ECN in the Netherlands. And it was really almost a parallel effort that what Grid Agents was doing. And we decided it would be interesting to kind of collaborate and share stories about how we're going to do this. They were also interested in putting micro CHP in, combined heating, cooling, and power. These things are about the size of a dishwasher, and they would go into a home and be able to produce power, produce heat, and have a much higher efficiency. However, the appetite for putting those kind of systems in Northern Europe and in places like Holland, they will actually accommodate more cost than they'd be in the United States. So I think we're a little behind in that area in terms of accepting those kind of technologies in the home. But there was another project where we worked on where the same basic issues showed up in terms of this grid variability. I won't talk much about this. This is sort of the precursor to getting into the agent approach, but back in the late 90s, and I was at Silicon Energy, we were using the concept of, with a utility, Long Island Light and Power and Carrier Comfort Choice thermostats, and the idea was to show that you can reduce the temperature set points on a whole lot of thermostats residentially, and this is, again, back in 1998, and the idea was you create spinning reserve in the energy market. So instead of having to turn generators on and be available, you could reduce the load on the system and not really change a lot of the customer's perception of their temperature in their home. By just doing 1 degree on everybody's home, they would barely be able to perceive it. And this is what many, many companies that have evolved since then, Tendril and many others that are going after this residential idea of doing load management in homes. And that sort of evolved into, and I call that virtual spinning reserve. Now that got into, at Silicon Energy, we built more of a view where you could have any type of generation source mixed with demand response and any type of system that you could aggregate together, and this is the virtual power plant concept. Again, almost a year later, we built this system, and DT Energy Technologies helped build it, and they actually, I think, still have the software running as well as some other utilities. That's what I call evolution 2. So these are all like what I could call web-based, web services-based sort of enterprise management of these different types of sources. And there's been many companies that have evolved since then that are moving the same approach forward. And then in Infotility in the early days, we put together a publish-subscribe middleware where we could talk to any relay and any meter, and we could turn things on and off and talk to the energy market and do what's called, automated demand response. So this is the precursor to what's now OpenADR, but we work with LBL, and even previous to LBL, we worked and we actually had this running in multiple facilities in California where we were turning loads on and off. In fact, at one point we turned a 10 megawatt load on and off at the Stanford Linear Accelerator, and we're paying them $1 million a year to do that prior to 2003. So again, that's web services based. And then what happened after that is we got into this sort of agent-based approach. And I don't have enough time. We can have another whole webinar on agents and why they're interesting and cool. But essentially what the agents represent is a way to embed a lot of the modeling and behavior of all these individual devices and let them communicate directly to each other via a method that allows us to control these things and do it in a way that the biggest issue with agents, that people hear that and they say, oh, the agents are going to take over and they're going to control everything, and the utility is going to lose the ability to control the system. And there's very valid points around how that could be a problem if put in the wrong hands. However, they can be really valuable, too, to do things and take away some of the routine sort of issues that we don't want to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And we're now in that mode where under IntelliGrid and GridWise and the Modern Grid Initiative and all these, the thing that came to the top of the surface with all this is that if the smart grid is really going to work, everyone agreed that what we need is some sort of, whether or not the semantics of calling it agents or something else doesn't matter, but we need some kind of a semi-autonomous agent-based approach to really coordinating all these things. When you just look at the sheer numbers of how many devices are going to be connected. In a parallel world, something called the pervasive internet, there's literally billions of devices that are being monitored now that are just dumb systems that we can collect data from. Now imagine all those billions of devices that are being monitored now have to actually provide ability to talk to each other and control each other and so on. And that may never happen to the extent of the monitoring world, but just the sheer fact of the number of things on the grid that would need to communicate to keep a reliable system requires some sort of agent-based approach. Here's an example of what that might resolve into. So you might want to call it a dynamic energy transaction engine. You can call it whatever you want. The idea is if we look at what are distributed energy resources, in the lower box, you've got things that inside of buildings or connected to buildings are things that I call DER resources. And those are things like battery, storage, black start of a generator, load shifting of a load, a plug electric vehicle, any type of control strategy, microgrid controls, so on. The issue is that from the grid's perspective, it's really all the same thing. It's just simply generation in reverse. It's just reducing load when I'm trying to balance this in real time, so I'm just trying to figure out how to aggregate that into something that looks like its capacity. So from the grid's perspective, it doesn't really care how it's being produced, but it does put a series of constraints on the timing and how long it takes to ramp up and how long you have to provide it for and so on. And that's where what's really needed is something that allows you to model the distributed energy resource outputs on one side and be able to then turn that into, on the energy market side, the energy market is interested in very specific things. For example, with ancillary services traditionally provided by generators, one called the spinning and non-spinning reserve, and they're at 30 and 10-minute and 30-minute intervals, and what the grid wants is backup. The real-time demand on the grid and the real-time supply of the grid are unmatched, and so the grid operator needs to say, in the next 10 minutes, I need to produce a megawatt of power. And so distributed energy resources, even things like demand response, we're working on a project currently where you can aggregate multiple buildings, measure it in relatively very fast increments. Lawrence Berkeley Lab has done lots of work on this, but we're doing a test pilot with New York ISO and Con Edison territory, where you aggregate multiple buildings, you get a minimum of a megawatt available, and then within 10 minutes you have to ramp it up, and then you have to do 6-second telemetry to verify that you're doing it. But from the grid's perspective, that looks like an ancillary service. It looks like you're actually providing power to the grid. But what you're really doing is taking power off the grid. And that could be done in multiple modes. That could be intelligent building controls. That could be using a battery rectifier, or it could be using a backup generator. Again, it doesn't matter. Again, talking about some of the ways that distributed energy resources can benefit the grid. In the big picture, you've got this dynamic energy transaction engine, you've got buildings, and you have on-site generation, and you have electric vehicles and intelligent load controls, and you got microgrids and all this, and you've also got the grid itself and the energy market. In the big picture, if they're going to really become relevant participating resources, active, what in Netherlands they call active networks, they have to be able to maintain this control strategy and do it in a way that the utility engineer is used to. A utility engineer is used to saying there's a generator and I'm going to turn it on, ramp it up, and it's going to provide these qualitative characteristics. Well, for distributed energy resources to do that is a big leap because there's a lot of communications and control and a lot of validation, a lot of settlement, and a lot of the issues around doing that are going to require a lot of communications and control, a lot of metering data, and again, bad data is just going to produce bad results. So a lot of this has to do with, well, you could think you have what you have, but until you really see it and verify it and settle it, you may not. And until then, until we get to that point where it's very much a trusted resource, there's a lot of work to be done here and going back to the Gridwise Architecture Council and IntelliGrid, a lot of that work was to develop at least an architecture and a framework for what the standards need to look like, and now that's been passed on to NIST and IEC and other standards bodies to really build the standards around how this has to work for it to be considered to be valid. And that, I would have to say, is moving forward. It's not going to happen very, very quickly, but it's moving forward at a fast enough clip that I think it's really going to, when you get certain things that happen with those standards, it sometimes takes a few years or 5 years before you really see the impact of that. It was the same way with the interconnection standards of photovoltaics. In a lot of ways, if you look at a PV, a photovoltaic inverter, they are what I consider to be the precursor to a microgrid, because they had to go through the whole set of things about what happens when this inverter pushes power back onto the grid, what happens when the power goes out, and a lot of those standards that were developed on a PV inverter are what, if you look at a bigger picture, what a microgrid in a building has to operate at the same level of integrity. And that's essentially what a microgrid is. It's a much larger version. There's another concept of just asset monitoring, if you're looking at just monitoring the things on the grid. The same things we're talking about. These are all, in my world, considered to be DER, solar, plug electric vehicles, storage devices. They all have to be essentially monitored first, and then you need to understand, once you monitor them, how you're going to use them to do this optimal control of the grid, or the microgrid, or the home, or wherever these are situated. In a building context, one of the biggest issues the building owners have is they either have a cost issue where they don't want the demand charges to reach a really high level, or they're concerned from a corporate standpoint that they want to reduce their carbon footprint. Well, you can do either of those, but you can't do both at the same time all the time. So you need to decide which one is what you really are looking for. And there's also a whole series of things we'll get into in another time, which are some of the control strategies that allow you to introduce into the grid things like power quality and VAR control and other things that will increase the ability of the grid to maintain integrity, that can be done in a distributed basis, that are much better. If anyone wants a broader view of distributed energy and their benefits, there's been multiple studies written by RMI called Smallest Profitable, and he was even a book written, and there's been a whole lot of other work done by EPRI and so on that I have access to. If anyone wants it, I can send them the information. But I'm not going to cover all the benefits and all the features and all the things. There's been many people that have done that and done a really good job of characterizing that. But when you think of when you're integrating these things at a very large level, what comes out of this is that most of the work I've done talking to the customer is the customer is interested a lot of times in just trying to reduce their carbon footprint, or picking a generation technology that's either higher reliability, or it gives them more sense of comfort that if the grid goes out, they're going to have something that backs them up. From the utility perspective, it seems to be much more geared towards, it's just about maintaining all these assets. And the beauty of distributed energy resources is that if you do it correctly, and if it's operated under some integration with the utility operational model and not separate from it, you can provide lots of benefits to examples of as an asset utilization, increasing the lifespan, the integrity, and the reliability of the grid around it. And I think this is where this is all moving forward, is that I think utilities, the more they see distributed energy resources on their grid, the more they will want to own and operate them. And they'll want to coordinate with the ones that are customer-sited. I also, under the Marin Energy Authority project, we sort of prototyped this thing called the Smart Community Manager. And the idea was mainly providing visibility, interaction with what I call emerging distributed energy resources on the grid. And those are the same things I talked about. And some of the real basic things are just, where are these things? What's the output? What's its predicted output? You know, just basic information. We work with Con Edison. There was a lot of things where they would just like to know. There's a lot of customers who have backup generators in Manhattan. You can imagine all these buildings where Con Edison doesn't have visibility into those. They don't know if there's a resource that could be utilized. So if you just simply had a system that said, push the distributed energy resources onto the grid, and just simply give the utilities the visibility to say, here's what it is, here's what it's doing, that would be a huge increase in what I consider to be the smart grid, just getting to that level. So the distributed energy manager was, community energy manager was based on this idea that communities and campuses and people who wanted to manage their own sort of semblance of distributed energy, this could also go towards a municipal utility or a co-op or a smaller entity, to give them visibility into the things that they're pushing onto their grid. And when you talk about it, there's all kinds of things you could do there that we're working on, but things like a system-wide demand curve, production monitoring and alerting, economic planning. If you wanted to do demand response, could you implement your own program? If what you're trying to do is portfolio optimization, where in the case of Marin Energy Authority, what their big issue is they want to eventually allow people to become a little bit green and a little bit more green and a little bit more green, to the point where in 20 years from now they have their whole system is produced with the highest level of green power production, including energy efficiency, demand response, and clean technologies. Again, this issue of now you've got integration with weather data and the pricing data about how you would operate these things if you had ability to do things that would get paid from the grid operator. What happens when there's electric vehicles? And then you get into the sort of the developer viewpoint, and they have their own set of things that are very similar data about what happens when all these things are on the system if I'm managing them. If I'm actually a microgrid developer or I'm a utility itself and I've got all this information, I may not have access to any of this if I'm the utility, because it doesn't fit into my normal SCADA system. And if I don't own it, this is one of the key problems. If the utility doesn't own these resources, they don't know how to utilize them. So this was designed to provide information to multiple entities. So you have the municipalities and the energy authorities and the microgrid owners, you've got the developers and the utilities, and then you've got the residential and commercial customers. And they all have their own viewpoint into what they're interested in. From a residential standpoint, they just want to know how much production have I done, how much have I net metered. This issue that's emerging, I think one of the really interesting issues emerging around distributed solar is what's called virtual net metering, and the idea that I don't have the ability to put a PV system on the roof, and I'd like to buy into a couple of panels or 3 or 4 kilowatts of system and just pay for the output of those, but I'll own them. And there's been some really interesting work done around that with some industry leaders and pioneers, and Marin Energy Authority is also interested in that, among others, among many others. And then from the commercial customer standpoint, more to do with how do I do intelligent load control to essentially do automatic demand response so I can reduce my energy bill, reduce my carbon footprint, and so on. And we're working on a lot of those issues actively. That's it for now. I think I may have went probably longer than I should have, and I don't know to what extent I went too far into detail or not enough, but I really wanted to give the audience a synopsis of what my perspective, my personal perspective on what I consider to be the issues are by example, not just by talking about general viewpoints and things that I read. So these are things that I picked up from just sort of incrementally working on it over a long period of time. And I thank Erfan for letting me at least talk for this long, and if any, I'll leave it to him to figure out if there's any questions or how we move forward on this.
Thank you very much, Dave, and it has been a truly educational experience. And one nice thing about such presentations is that no matter how well-versed you are with the subject, you can always learn, if nothing else, a different perspective. So I really appreciate the very detailed and diverse presentation that you've shared, especially the business cases, the case studies, the use cases, the examples that you've shown on how real utilities are deploying distributed energy resources. There is a question from the audience, but what I wanted to do was ask you a couple of questions about distributed energy resources in terms of planning the future. As you're aware, the centralized power plants have been producing electricity for a long time, and they've enjoyed a certain economies of scale. But because of certain environmental drivers and cost of putting plants, the prospects of putting new centralized plants is not that appealing at the current time. So distributed energy resources are being looked on increasingly to fill that gap as electricity becomes more and more in demand. So the question that I have is, how does a distributed energy resource address the gap that exists in the economies of scale in terms of the cost differential? And how do we move forward with that as more and more of these centralized power plants are decommissioned and more of the energy mix is moved onto this virtual power plant? How do we handle that while keeping the cost level? Dave?
Erfan, I had you on mute, so I didn't want to, but yes, I got your question, and what I was going to say is it seems like it goes back to basics here, which is, the issue about how plants get developed and how things happen is still based on simple economics called, levelized cost of energy. So from a distributed energy resource perspective, what's happening around different parts, and it's happening in different places at different times, because depending on which technology, whether or not it's wind or solar or even natural gas technology on a more smaller basis, you look at the levelized cost of energy, but what the real issue, it's been like this for as long as I can remember, is that if you're an investor from a portfolio standpoint and you're investing in a coal plant or a nuclear plant, and you're doing the levelized cost of energy calculation, you're not assuming for any kind of anomaly like a carbon tax, or in the case of natural gas, where you've got a volatile market where right now it's super cheap, but we're not very thoughtful to think about what happens in 6 years when the price triples. So this has happened several times in the industry, where even a company like Calpine was betting on natural gas, combined cycle natural gas plants to make money off of, and then the price of natural gas went way up. When you talk about distributed energy, it depends on what your bias is, but in solar, particularly in wind, the concept of grid parity is when you look at the levelized cost of energy in the exact geographic location, including fuel costs and maintenance and operations and all that, you get to a point where it becomes very straightforward to make this analysis, and you're actually choosing a portfolio. And what's happening with distributed solar under 10 kilowatts is that what's really driving that is very, very rapid decreases in the module costs. The balance of systems are still relatively expensive compared to the modules now. And some of the recent activities about the anti-dumping from Chinese companies is causing this issue where we're looking at not too far ahead, where the grid, what's called grid parity, where you can produce solar with your own solar system. Now, it doesn't address the intermittency problem, which is what are you going to do so the grid becomes a storage mechanism at that point, and a very good one at that. So the issue that I have with when people look at the economics and is that when you look at the fuel costs of something like natural gas, coal, or nuclear, what's never really taken into account is the high potential volatility of those prices based on things we just don't know. So the siting issues, the fact that natural gas could go way up or way down, the fact that some kind of permitting issue would make nuclear very difficult. These issues are making distributed energy look a lot better. And you've got the examples are, go to Wall Street. What's happening there? And you've got companies like Enphase microinverters going public. You've got a lot of what it looks to me, a lot of the distributed energy resource companies are actually doing better than the really, really large scale stuff. You've got companies like Solar City and Sunrun that are looking at new financing mechanisms to make this available to people at no cost. Even though inherently it's going to cost the owner more, they don't have to worry about putting any money down. So to me, it's really an issue of the fundamental benefit of distributed energy resources is tied to the fact that majority of what I call DER fit into the category of there isn't a lot of fuel cost. In the case of electric vehicles, it's a very different economic analysis because you really have to be careful geographically where you are to determine what your miles per gallon are and what your real cost of operating and all that are, because it depends on the fuel mix that you're offsetting. And there was a really good study done on Wall Street recently that showed that depending on what part of the country, and you could have an electric vehicle and get an equivalent of 30 miles per gallon, or you could get 90. And in some of the cases, if you're talking about 30, reciprocating engines are actually way ahead of that curve. I've got a Mini Cooper that gets 40 miles per gallon. and it's just a gas engine. So I guess what I would wrap up that discussion is that the economic analysis of large scale versus smaller scale is that the trend is very clear that even if you assume that natural gas is going to become very, very cheap in the short term, in the long term, if we put a lot of natural gas assets in, that's going to cause more demand, and based on simple supply and demand, that price is going to go up eventually. Whereas in the renewable sector, those prices don't have any fuel cost, and they have lower cost of CapEx to build them over time. So to me, the trend is, no matter how you slice it, you're going to see more and more smaller scale distributed energy systems. Now, you could get into the whole argument, which I won't, about what is the optimal size of a distributed energy resource. This has been an argument for 20-plus years. And I think that's what's happening now, is that we know we can put PV on residences. We know we can do wind at certain scale, and it makes sense. But now what's emerging is what's in the middle of all that. What's in between these 250 megawatt plants that we're putting in the desert of Nevada and California, which make a lot of sense, and these small little 5 kilowatt systems on the roof. Or what's in the middle of that is where the biggest opportunity is, which is you get a couple hundred kilowatts, half of a megawatt system, and you install it somewhere as a sort of a medium size, maybe you call it, I don't know what you call it, but at that level, you can now have a lot of people participating in that without having to have everybody have it on their roof, because I do think that the economics do not support everybody having their own system in all cases, in many cases. So I think what you'll see is the size of what's considered to be a distributed energy resource may go up and down over time, but eventually, if you wait long enough, there will be no reason why everybody shouldn't have a distributed energy resource on their roof or on their premise. And then it goes into a very interesting place, 20, 30 years from now, where you get into this concept of energy harvesting, where the concept of a distributed energy resource becomes very, very small, where you've got a mailbox wrapped in solar photovoltaic material, you've got telephone poles, you've got street lights that are self-powered. You get into this whole area where you can start thinking about how to collect energy from anywhere there's a surface. And I know that's a little bit far off from where people's heads are, but that's where this is going to end up in the longer term. So really what it does is it pushes the notion of distributed energy resource to, over time, it gets smaller and smaller where the value starts getting generated. And again, going back to the initial premise here, if you produce power in the middle of the desert, you still, whether or not it's wind or solar or coal or nuclear, you still have to transport it from where the power is produced to where it's being used. And that's fundamentally the real benefit of distributed energy resources, that you're producing power where it's being used.
Very good. Thanks. There are 3 questions from the audience, and others are writing them as we speak. Dali Kladar says, please compare 2 virtual power plants, technical virtual power plants with commercial virtual power plants. What are the practical issues if these 2 VPPs are not overlapping?
The question was compare technical versus commercial?
Yeah.
Not sure I understand the distinction between the two. I think the concept when you say virtual means that you don't really have a power plant for one, so you're using something else to make it look like a power plant, right? So in the concept of a technical version of that, it's physical devices that are aggregated together to look like a larger power plant. So whether or not it's aggregated output of PV panels or aggregated reduction of load, if that would be considered a technical one, then they'd have to be located in the same region or the same part of the distribution network for them to be valuable. So you couldn't just introduce this notion of, well, I'm reducing load over in Washington, but I'm benefiting the grid over in Ohio. And I think maybe that's what he's talking about, but I'm not sure. So what I think where we're moving, though, is that the concept of maybe we will get to the point with the contractual, if you look at how to operate a virtual power plant, there's the issue of how do you verify and monitor the output of the system so that it's matched with a service that says, okay, this is now real capacity on the grid, and that's more of a technical approach. The other one is where we wouldn't be so concerned about exactly where the power is being injected or timing, but we'd be collecting it all together and adding it together and saying we've created, SMUD did this, where they created a 600 megawatt power plant out of just doing demand response, but I don't believe it was ever coordinated. It was just they determined that they could eliminate a 600 megawatt power plant by doing all this energy efficiency and load reduction. So beyond that, I don't, unless he wants to get a little more specific about what he means by the difference, that's what I would say.
Yeah, let's move along because there are the questions, and Dali can follow up with you later. The next question from Ali Firuzi is, what's David's view on the 5-year future of true microgrids in the developing nations, meaning a system that is allowed by the utilities to intentionally island and take care of its own electrical/thermal loads?
Now, this is in outside of the U.S., right? International.
Yes.
Well, I see it as being actually easier to deploy them if you don't have regulatory barriers and things like that. But I guess in places like island regions where you have a company locally here in Boulder, Peter Lilienthal has some software where he evaluates these sort of what happens if you have a diesel backup generator and a solar power system or a wind system, and how do you optimize the offset between running natural gas and using renewables. But that's not a true, I mean, to me, the viability of a microgrid in an area where there's no regulatory barriers are probably much higher to be able to implement, and much higher to tell the value, because you don't have to worry about, especially if the grid is not already there, you have to run the lines and so on. And that's always been, in the United States, one of the biggest issues with the microgrid is for years it's been a beautiful concept, but it's been illegal. And for all practical purposes, it still is illegal to run a microgrid, because what you really want to do in a microgrid is not just when the disconnection from the grid happens, reduce all the critical loads and turn on all the backup generators and all the solar and all that. What you really want to do is feed power to across the street or to somebody else that's not in the same network as you, so that you could sell power to the guy across the street. But that's technically, in most IOU territories, not legal. So I would say that the answer to that question is that it's a much higher viability for those projects outside of the U.S. where the regulatory constraints do not exist.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from William Miller. He says, I've not seen near enough discussion of energy retention in otherwise storage on a distributed basis. Would you comment on that prospect?
Well, maybe out of my realm, because I'm not an expert on storage per se. I know other people who are. I guess my comment around why you don't see a lot of it is that, from my perspective, most of the storage projects that have been done on the grid have been done at larger scale, and things like, pumping of water uphill at night and pushing the power back down and creating power during peak hours. In terms of battery technology, clearly the reason why we haven't seen so much the lead-acid batteries and some of these new, actually old, been around for a really long time, nickel-iron batteries can provide critical backup power for smaller scale solar systems, and those are distributed fairly a lot, but there's just not that many of them out there. Some utilities, like First Energy, are looking at community scale storage, where they would actually, as a utility, go out and install a box in a neighborhood that had storage and communications, so that all the individual homeowners who put photovoltaics or whatever electric vehicles in their premises, they could locally provide storage right there where it's needed, and sort of aggregate this concept of, instead of everybody having to have a battery in their garage, you could share a battery among 20 homes. But generally, I think one of the biggest issue with storage is that until EVs really reduce the cost way down to a much higher level, you're just not going to see that many places where people are choosing to put in storage as a viable standalone resource unless it's in critical power applications like data centers and places where remote situations. So I think we will see a change in that, but it's still down to the fundamentals of economics.
Okay. We have a few questions, so we'll try to keep the answers short so we can get to all of them. Dali follows up by saying he's trying to compare a first microgrid that is like a 1 million volt ampere generation with a 1.5 million volt ampere load. That was the first microgrid. And the second microgrid, he says, 1.5 million volt ampere generation and 1 million volt ampere load. And he says, which microgrid would you invest in? I guess that's how he's distinguishing the technical from the commercial.
I would say have him give me a call.
Okay, very good. And that's what we will do. Now let's move on to the other questions here. We had 4 questions. One question from Michael Shea says, many schools have had their parking lots covered with solar panels. Would these DER be connected with local utility control and monitoring infrastructure for utility to coexist with them or even manage them?
Typically, the way they've currently been structured is that a third-party private developer will develop the project, and then they'll finance it through tax equity and through straight-up equity, and then they'll either own it and sell it to somebody else, so it's owned by a third party. And in those cases, there's no real integration, tight integration with the utility. In some cases, when utilities start installing these and owning the asset themselves and call it an actual, just like they're going to buy a power plant, they're going to actually invest in solar. I think that's the future where the utility does it, and then it would be integrated. But the things that I've seen so far is that there's just mainly a monitoring solution that allows you to look at the output of the system, but there isn't really a bidirectional control with most of the systems that are out there. They happen to be, from a utility standpoint, sort of assets that exist, but they don't really know what the output is or what the integration is with their own operations.
Yeah, so a related question to that is, doesn't it make more sense, as the Clean Coalition and other groups are saying, that even though people are producing power in their facilities, that they should sell it into the wholesale market and then buy the clean electricity back at whatever rate the regulatory framework allows them to buy it back on? Because that way, the kilowatt hours that they're producing are given to the utility so that their infrastructure costs can be spread out over all those kilowatt hours, as opposed to creating a lot of net zero type premises and leaving the utility to provide for that little bit of electricity at certain times and passing the whole fixed infrastructure cost on very few kilowatt hours.
Yeah, I think to some extent that's going to happen in some of these solar farms in the future, where the output will be sold to the utility at wholesale rates, and the customer then would buy the power at the equivalent retail rate. And so that's in sort of the virtual net metering approach. You would essentially be buying power for maybe a couple of points less than what you were buying it before with the fuel cost escalation agreement. In the case of existing net metering policies where they're getting paid a different price than the wholesale rate, because the issue, it's a complex issue, and it's been going on for quite a while in various states and various rulings around net metering. But the basic premise was designed around the fact that, look, if you look at the volatility of the wholesale prices across the 7 ISOs in the U.S. and Canada, you see huge variability in between the average and obviously the spikes were based on location and based on the peaking aspect, what the wholesale prices are. So from the utility standpoint, they'd like to have that mapped directly to the wholesale price, and that makes sense. But the argument is that at 3 in the afternoon, when a photovoltaic system is producing power, it has more value than if it produced power at 11 in the morning, because of just sheer the way that most summer peaking utilities have a problem between 2 and 5 in the afternoon, and so the net metering policies were designed to accommodate that. Maybe what the issue is to make it more scalable and larger, they could just agree on a price structure that would just push all the power back into the system and then buy it back at the retail rate, and not consider the system that it's differentially going to be valued differentially, but look at it like it's just going in. But that's the problem, is that you're taking away, by doing that, you're taking away one of the highest benefits that they have to offer. So that's why you're going to find a lot of argument on this. On the level of argument, it's more valuable at different times of day, and the ancillary services market and the wholesale power markets will validate that. That's why coal power is used for baseload power at night, and that's why it's very cheap at night, because these plants are easy to run continuously. But the problem is the variable part, when it's 3 or 4 in the afternoon. That's why this is going to be an ongoing issue, and I don't even pretend to know how it's going to get resolved, because it's every regulatory body and every public utility commission and every municipality has a different view on this.
Yes. So we have 3 more questions left in about 12 minutes, so I'd like to get to those. Vish Ganti asks, Dave, I'm Vish from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. From a very high level, can you comment on some tools we can use for SmartGrid modeling studies?
Wow. SmartGrid modeling. I think Pacific Northwest Labs has a thing called Grid Lab, and it's an open sourced approach where you can use and collaborate with them on some tools. And I imagine if you're from LBL, you probably are already aware of that, so I'd probably just giving you information you already know. I'm not actually aware, other than under Modern Grid Initiative, we talked about doing some modeling, and what we determined is that you'd have to stack a lot of systems together. You've got a lot of different system levels of timing and things at the smaller level to up to the the distribution level to the transmission level and all that, to really do a good job of it. And I'm not aware of anybody other than some labs that have done that. Most of my work in simulation has been around simulating either single buildings or clusters of buildings. So depending on what you're talking about, when you're talking about a system level view of that, I think I'm not aware of anything that's out there, but that doesn't mean there isn't anything available.
All right. Next question is from Steve McGill, who says, from a utility systems perspective, what's the biggest system gap or gaps in implementing DER?
Biggest? It's hard to generalize on that, but for many utilities, it's really simply at the board level. They have an aversion to it, and it's not, they think in the back of their minds that the best way to build out their generation portfolio is to do this on a centralized basis, because it appears to be more easily to understand. It's what they've done in the past, and it's going to be the best thing to do in the future. I think the biggest barrier is not technical, because if they looked at their network and said, why is it that all these independent private parties on the side of someone like Enernoc, who's a demand response provider, they are separate from the utility 100%. They're actually providing the service like you, and the utility really should be looking at that and providing that. The same goes with distributed energy resources. I have to say I work with some utilities who are way ahead of the curve than others. So it's not across the board. There's some very, what I consider to be next generation utilities that are incorporating this into their business model. That's not all. It just happens to be, it's going to be a lot more significant in places where the economics are getting much better, and the fuel prices and the offset costs of producing it with the larger scale systems are starting to really impact them. I happen to know that FERC just recently through the EPA mandated the closure of a bunch of coal plants in the Northeast, I think in Ohio and Pennsylvania. And I believe that was not a decision made by the utility, but that was made by, you know, the environmental regulations. So you may see those utilities responding to that in a much different way now. There may just be, but he asked what the biggest barrier is. The biggest barrier is psychological. It's what they agree at the board level as an investor-owned utility to do. And if they got over that part and said, this is what we're going to do, they'd probably find that there's a lot of economically viable projects they could be involved in. And I'm sure I'd create huge amounts of disagreement if I said that statement, but that's truly what I believe.
All right. Mike Marullo says, the Sierra Club has recently admitted that they didn't really like the idea of roof acres of solar panels any more than they like proliferating fossil fuel facilities. So isn't there a fundamental issue with large-scale deployment of DER?
I don't see what the issue is personally. I'm not sure what they'd be referencing related to that. It seems to me like, depending on what your goal is. You know, the thing I didn't talk about, and the thing that rarely gets talked about is, and this is, by the way, why the U.S. Army and the Department of Defense and the military gets this, because they know exactly what this means. From a resilience standpoint, what's the most resilient system? Obviously, it has to be the one where if the power goes off the main grid, the more people who have their own standalone power capability, forget about putting it back into the grid, the more you can island the system, the more stable the system is going to be, because you have a resilience issue. And you can't look at it any other way. There's no argument that says anything differently. The more there's just less, and that's how the internet was architected. The reason why the internet is so bulletproof is that no matter what you do to it, you can take down big chunks of it, but there's always going to be independent islands of computers that are on that are able to compute and do things. They may not be able to access the internet, but there's still computers that are there. And with power, I can't imagine what they're thinking there. I happen to be a little bit unaware of why they're saying that about the idea that they don't support this idea of, they may be thinking that it's cost too much to do it that way. But if you change the reason why you're doing it to it's not the cheapest way, but the way to get the most resilient network, and you're looking at it from the perspective of the individual who wants power, go back and look at the outages that have happened. I mean, I'm a big proponent of the utilities and said, you know, if you really look at it over the past 30 years, there's been very few major outages. The one in 2004 was a really large outage, and it caused cascading outages, and power plants tripped and turned off, and people lost power for, you know, 8 to 12 hours. What happens if that happens for 3 days in a place like New York City? I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but the fact is, if you've got a highly distributed system, there's no argument that says that that wouldn't be more resilient than having a big system that goes out. It was a few years ago that United Airlines reservation system went out, and what they found is it was highly centralized. So no one could make a reservation anywhere. That does not make any sense if that's what your criteria is. If you're just trying to provide sheer lowest cost way to produce power, then that doesn't become relevant. Again, I say these statements with I have a very different viewpoint on this and a very passionate viewpoint of I think why distributed is better. But you know, I would love to have an argument where someone tells me why that is the case, what Sierra Club said, because I don't see where that would come from.
Yeah, there may be some connection with the aesthetic aspect as well as some environmental impacts of manufacturing these panels on a large scale. It may
well,
not
you could say the same thing about vehicles then. Yeah.
There is a question from Leah Parks who says, could you specify which utilities you consider the most forward-thinking? That's a tough question.
Yeah, that is, because I'm afraid if I say it and I don't include somebody out, they'll say, why didn't you mention me? But I guess, you know, the obvious ones on the municipal side are Sacramento Municipal Utility District, SMUD. Austin Energy is pretty forward-thinking. Consumers Power. I happen to think that, my viewpoint is that I think PG&E is making good strides into changing, and they're aware of their problems, and the very large investor-owned utilities have a serious issue because they have a big, huge infrastructure they've already paid for. And so you got to give them a little bit of break and say if they're going to move from where they are now to where they want to be, it's going to take a while. It's one of the biggest issues is that I think a lot of the utilities want to do the right thing, but they just they realize they're being regulated. They have the Public Utility Commission breathing down their neck to keep costs down, and so they're just moving at a pace that makes sense for them. So for the most part, where you're going to see most of the faster moving adoption of this is in the municipals, the co-ops, smart cities initiatives, and things like that, where the decisions are being made in a very collective basis that are outside of the investor-owned utility. How do I produce the most value for my shareholders in the short term? But it's not that the utilities are bad. Some of them are constrained by the fact that they can't actually do anything quicker than what they're doing because of regulatory issues.
Thanks. So Mike Marullo says that I think maybe NREL, Golden, Colorado, and/or DNV, Kima, and Chalafon, Pennsylvania may have something that can help VISH as far as the systems modeling tools are concerned. And then he also says that the Sierra Club thinks rooftop solar fully deployed at scale is ugly and disrupts bird rooks. So I guess there is a non-energy aspect to it. Thank you, Dave, for answering the questions of our audience, and thank you for your wonderful presentation. I think we have one more final thing. Oh, yes, we have Dale Gutierrez, who's thanking you for your honesty and good talk. So
thank you. Thank everybody for listening, and if anybody wants to talk further, I've got several email addresses, but the Dave@Infotility and the phone number listed there is valid if you want to contact me and chat about anything in the future.
Wonderful. So thanks again, and thank you to the audience. A couple of footnotes. One is that next Monday, June 25th, we're going to have our seminar at IBM in Foster City on Hillsdale Avenue. I will be sending the details. It will be from 4 p.m. to 7 p.m., and our keynote speaker will be Francis Cleveland, who is going to give us a status update on the standards for distributed energy resources. Dave mentioned the importance of the standards and the evolution. She's going to get into the details and explain what's going on in the NIST Priority Action Plan for DER, as well as what's going on in the IEC community and other standards bodies. So that will be June 25th, 4 to 7 p.m. And with that, I would like to conclude our webcast today, and I appreciate all of your participation, and Dave for your wonderful presentation. At this time, I'm going to stop the recording. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks.